threat hunting and red team exercises exist because routine alerting by itself rarely tells the full story of how a capable adversary moves through an environment. Traditional monitoring is designed to catch known bad signals, and that is valuable, but it can leave gaps when attackers operate quietly, blend into normal administration, or use legitimate tools in suspicious ways. Hunting and red teaming step into that space by deliberately searching for weaknesses and behaviors that are not guaranteed to trigger an alarm. When done with discipline, these practices replace assumptions with evidence about what your defenses actually notice, how quickly your teams respond, and where your controls fail under realistic pressure. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CISSP books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Threat hunting is best understood as proactive analysis designed to find adversary behavior patterns before those patterns become an incident with business impact.
Instead of waiting for a detection rule to fire, hunting asks what an attacker would likely do in your specific environment, and then looks for traces of those actions across available data.
This is not random searching, because random searching becomes a hobby rather than a security capability, and it does not scale.
Good hunting is grounded in a working model of adversary techniques, the assets that matter most, and the telemetry that can confirm or refute a suspicion.
The outcome is not merely an interesting anomaly, and it is a defensible conclusion about whether adversary-like activity is present and what to do next.
A strong hunt begins with a hypothesis, because hypotheses give structure to what could otherwise become endless exploration. A hypothesis states a plausible adversary technique and links it to target assets, such as credentials, privileged roles, sensitive data repositories, or high-trust administrative paths. The best hypotheses are specific enough to guide data collection and queries, but flexible enough to evolve as evidence emerges. They often reflect what is likely, not what is dramatic, because attackers repeatedly succeed through mundane actions like credential reuse, remote execution, and quiet privilege changes. By anchoring the hunt to a hypothesis, you can measure progress, document decisions, and explain why a particular set of data was examined. Hypotheses also help you decide which techniques deserve attention first, and that decision should reflect likely attacker behavior and local business reality. If your environment depends heavily on cloud control planes, then hypotheses that center on token misuse, role escalation, and suspicious administrative application programming interface calls deserve priority. If your organization has heavy remote workforce access, then hypotheses that center on authentication anomalies, device posture changes, and persistence through session manipulation become more relevant. The point is not to cover every possible technique equally, because equal coverage is rarely efficient. The point is to focus on the techniques that would plausibly lead to high-impact outcomes in your environment, then iterate as your understanding improves. Data sources determine what you can confirm, so hunting requires a clear view of what telemetry exists and what gaps remain.
Endpoint telemetry can show process creation, command execution, module loads, registry changes, and suspicious parent-child process relationships that suggest abuse of legitimate tools.
Authentication logs can reveal sign-in patterns, failed attempts, multi-factor authentication prompts, token issuance, and changes to privilege assignments that indicate an attacker is working through identity rather than through malware.
Network flow data can provide the connective tissue, showing which hosts talk to which services, when lateral movement might be occurring, and whether unusual internal connections are appearing.
When these sources are combined, the hunt can move from a single clue to a coherent picture of activity.
Hunting requires an ability to distinguish benign anomalies from adversary-like sequences of actions, and that distinction depends on context and sequencing rather than on single events.
A single remote login at an unusual time may be harmless, but a remote login followed by a new service installation, followed by credential dumping behavior, followed by outbound connections to unusual internal targets is a pattern worth escalating. This is where sequences matter, because adversaries often create a chain of small actions that are each individually explainable but collectively suspicious. A mature hunter learns to ask what would normally happen next, and then checks whether the observed next steps match a legitimate workflow. When the sequence breaks the expected narrative, you have a lead that can support deeper investigation. That same sequencing mindset helps prevent wasted effort, because hunting can become noisy if it is based on novelty alone.
Many environments generate strange events that are perfectly normal, especially when automation, patching, configuration management, and developer tooling are active.
The objective is not to eliminate anomaly, and it is to identify anomalies that resemble adversary tradecraft and that intersect with valuable assets or privileged paths.
That is why hunting should align to hypotheses and known adversary techniques, rather than to curiosity alone.
When the hunt process includes clear documentation of why an anomaly was dismissed as benign, you build institutional memory and reduce repeat effort across the team. Red team exercises are a complementary discipline that emulates attacker tactics to test detection and response under controlled conditions. The emphasis is not on theatrical hacking, and it is on realistic validation of whether defenses can detect, triage, and contain meaningful attack paths. A red team might attempt initial access, privilege escalation, lateral movement, and objective completion, but the real value comes from observing what defenders see and how they interpret it. This tests the full chain from telemetry generation to alert logic, to analyst judgment, to incident response execution. When done well, red teaming exposes gaps that do not show up in policy documents or architecture diagrams, because it reveals how controls behave in practice.
Rules of engagement are what make red team activities safe, ethical, and useful, because they define scope, safety constraints, and success criteria before any action begins.
Scope clarifies which systems, environments, and data types are in bounds, and it should be explicit about what is excluded, especially safety-critical services and business-critical production paths that cannot tolerate disruption. Safety constraints include limits on techniques that could cause outages, data corruption, or irreversible changes, along with clear procedures for deconfliction and emergency stop conditions. Success criteria define what the exercise is meant to validate, such as whether a certain class of lateral movement is detected, or whether privileged role changes trigger investigation, or whether a sensitive data path is protected by effective segmentation. Without strong rules of engagement, the exercise risks becoming either too risky to run or too unrealistic to teach anything. A major advantage of well-run exercises is that they can produce clear, observable signals that tie directly to defensive requirements. If a red team can move from a standard user context to an administrative context without triggering meaningful detection, that is a concrete gap in monitoring, access control, or both. If a red team can access a sensitive store by abusing identity tokens rather than by exploiting software vulnerabilities, that is a concrete gap in identity governance, session control, or privileged access management. These outcomes are valuable because they are difficult to dismiss as theoretical, and they map cleanly to remediation work. They also clarify which controls are merely present and which controls are effective under adversarial pressure. Purple teaming tightens the feedback loop by aligning offense and defense to improve detections iteratively, rather than treating exercises as one-time events. In purple teaming, the offensive activity is coordinated with defenders so that both sides can observe, tune, and retest in near real time. This approach often accelerates improvement because defenders can adjust logging, enrich alerts, and refine correlation while the technique is still fresh and reproducible. It also helps prevent the false lesson that a missed detection is always an analyst failure, because purple teaming often reveals that the telemetry was incomplete or the alert logic was poorly mapped to the technique.
Over time, this builds a shared language between those who simulate attacks and those who must detect and respond to them, which raises the quality of both sides. The most valuable output from hunting and exercises is what happens after the activity, when findings are converted into practical defensive improvements.
Findings should become detection rules that look for the behavior patterns that mattered, not just the tools that were used, because tools change faster than techniques. They should also become playbooks that clarify how analysts should validate a signal, what data they should pull, and what containment actions are appropriate at different confidence levels. In many cases, the right fix is a control improvement rather than a detection, such as tightening privileged access pathways, reducing credential exposure, improving segmentation, or hardening identity policies. When the organization treats findings as engineering work with owners and timelines, hunting and red teaming stop being special events and start being a continuous improvement engine. Measurement is necessary because you need a way to know whether these activities are improving real security outcomes, and the most meaningful measures focus on dwell time, detection quality, and response speed. Dwell time refers to how long adversary-like activity can persist before it is detected and contained, and reducing it is often a direct reduction of impact. Detection quality concerns whether alerts are accurate, well-scoped, and actionable, because noisy alerts that cannot be trusted lead to fatigue and missed true positives. Response speed includes triage time, escalation time, containment time, and recovery coordination. Because a detection that arrives too late or triggers a slow response may still allow damage. Measurements should be used to guide investment and prioritize improvements, not to shame teams, because the purpose is capability building. Deception technologies can add leverage by creating signals that reveal lateral movement attempts and credential misuse that might otherwise remain ambiguous. Deception works by placing believable but controlled artifacts, such as decoy accounts, decoy services, or decoy credentials, in locations where legitimate users should not interact with them. When those artifacts are touched, the event is often high confidence because normal workflows do not explain the interaction. This can be especially helpful in internal environments where many administrative actions look similar and where baseline noise is high. Deception must be governed carefully to avoid interfering with legitimate operations, but when implemented thoughtfully, it can provide crisp detection opportunities and valuable insight into attacker movement patterns.
Reporting is where the organization captures what was learned, and it should include attack paths, gaps, and recommended control enhancements in a way that supports action rather than storytelling. For hunts, reporting should explain the hypothesis, the data examined, the patterns sought, and the conclusions reached, including what was ruled out and what remains uncertain due to telemetry gaps. For red team and purple team efforts, reporting should describe the path taken, the control points encountered, what was detected, what was missed, and how defenders responded in practice. Recommendations should connect directly to observed gaps, and they should be framed as specific improvements in logging, detection logic, access control, segmentation, or response process that can be validated in a follow-on run. A strong report also clarifies which findings are systemic versus situational, because systemic findings are where the highest leverage remediation usually lives.
Governance is the guardrail that ensures these activities do not disrupt operations or violate legal boundaries, and it is as important as technical capability.
Exercises must respect authorization, privacy obligations, and contractual constraints, particularly when systems process sensitive personal data or regulated information.
Operational governance ensures that testing does not cause outages, data corruption, or unsafe interference with production services,
and it provides a mechanism for deconfliction with other operational work, like maintenance windows and incident response.
Governance also clarifies who can approve scope, who owns risk acceptance for exercise actions, and how evidence is handled if activity uncovers a real compromise rather than a simulated one. When governance is clear, teams can run realistic validation confidently, and when it is unclear, teams either avoid realism or take risks they do not fully control.
Threat hunting and red team exercises increase confidence through realistic validation because they illuminate the space between what tools promise and what defenses actually achieve. Hunting forces disciplined, hypothesis-driven analysis that can reveal adversary-like sequences before they become obvious incidents, while also exposing where telemetry and context are insufficient. Red teaming tests the full defensive chain under controlled conditions, and purple teaming accelerates improvement by turning findings into tuned detections and hardened controls. When measurements track dwell time, detection quality, and response speed, progress becomes visible and defensible rather than anecdotal. Taken together, these practices convert uncertainty into evidence, and they build a security program that learns from realistic pressure instead of waiting for real damage to provide the lesson. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.